Captain Sarah Mitchell had always known she was different from the other soldiers in her unit. While her male counterparts were welcomed into the inner circles of military strategy and combat planning, she often found herself relegated to administrative duties and support roles, despite her exceptional record in intelligence analysis and tactical operations. The year was 2019, and even though women had been officially integrated into combat roles, the reality on the ground was far more complex and unwelcoming than the policy papers suggested. The forward operating base Sentinel sat like a concrete island in the harsh desert landscape of Eastern Europe, where NATO forces maintained a strategic presence along increasingly tense borders. Sarah had been stationed there for 8 months, serving under Commander Robert Hayes, a decorated veteran whose old-school mentality clashed sharply with the changing face of modern warfare. Hayes was the kind of officer who believed that military service was a man's world, and he made no effort to hide his disapproval of female soldiers in combat positions. Sarah's expertise lay in signals intelligence and threat assessment, skills she had honed through years of specialized training and real-world experience in conflict zones across the Middle East and Africa. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect patterns in enemy communications, to read between the lines of intercepted messages, and to piece together fragments of information that others missed entirely. Her colleagues respected her abilities, but Commander Hayes remained stubbornly resistant to acknowledging her contributions to the unit's success. The tension between Sarah and Hayes had been building for weeks. It started with small incidents, being excluded from briefings she should have attended, having her reports questioned more thoroughly than those of her male peers, and being assigned to duties that didn't utilize her specialized skills. The breaking point came during a heated exchange in the command center, where Sarah had attempted to present her analysis of unusual enemy radio traffic she had been monitoring. "Commander, I need to brief you on some concerning patterns I've detected in the intercepted communications," Sarah had said, approaching Hayes as he studied tactical maps with his senior staff. Hayes barely looked up from his charts. "Captain Mitchell, I believe I assigned you to inventory management this week. Perhaps you should focus on the tasks you've been given instead of playing intelligence analyst." Sarah felt her face flush with anger, but she maintained her professional composure. "Sir, with respect, my primary designation is intelligence officer, and I've identified what could be significant enemy activity in our sector." The conversation had escalated quickly, with Hayes making it clear that he questioned not only Sarah's judgment but her right to be there at all. The confrontation ended with Hayes issuing a direct order that would change everything. Sarah was to be transferred back to the main base, effective immediately, under the pretense that she needed additional training in following chain of command protocols. The news spread quickly through the base, and Sarah could feel the mixture of sympathy and awkwardness from her fellow soldiers. Some of her colleagues approached her privately to express their support and frustration with Hayes' decision. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, a communications specialist who had worked closely with Sarah, was particularly vocal about his displeasure. "This is complete bullshit, Captain," Rodriguez said as they stood outside the communications bunker that evening. "Everyone knows you're the best intelligence officer we've had here in years. Hayes is just too stubborn and proud to admit it." Sarah appreciated the support, but she also understood the delicate position her colleagues were in. Speaking out too strongly against a commanding officer could have serious consequences for their own careers. She had spent her entire military career navigating these complex dynamics, learning when to push back and when to accept unfair treatment for the greater good of unit cohesion. As she prepared for her unwanted transfer, Sarah continued to monitor the intelligence feeds, partly out of habit and partly because she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was brewing. The radio intercepts she had been analyzing showed a pattern that deeply troubled her: increased chatter about a special delivery and references to coordinates that seemed to center around their current position. The language was coded, but Sarah's experience had taught her to recognize the subtle indicators of major enemy operations. The night before her scheduled departure, Sarah sat in the intelligence center, reviewing the latest batch of intercepted communications. The base was quieter than usual, with most of the personnel either on patrol or catching some much-needed rest. The soft hum of electronic equipment and the occasional crackle of radio static created a familiar backdrop as she worked through the data. What she discovered in those late-night hours would prove to be the most important intelligence analysis of her career. Hidden within seemingly routine enemy communications was evidence of a plan so audacious and terrifying that she initially questioned her own interpretation. The enemy had acquired tactical nuclear capabilities and was planning to deploy them against NATO positions, with forward operating base Sentinel identified as the primary target. The pieces of the puzzle came together slowly but inexorably. Code words that had seemed meaningless suddenly revealed their true significance when viewed in context with troop movements, supply routes, and timing references. The enemy had been planning this operation for months, carefully orchestrating a strike that would eliminate a significant NATO presence while sending a clear message about their willingness to escalate conflicts to previously unthinkable levels. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she compiled her findings into a comprehensive report. She knew that what she had uncovered would be dismissed by Commander Hayes, who had already made it clear that he didn't value her analytical capabilities. But she also knew that the lives of everyone on the base depended on someone taking her warnings seriously. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her as she stared at the evidence spread across her workstation. Satellite imagery showed unusual enemy activity in sectors that aligned perfectly with the intercepted communications. Supply convoys had been moving specialized equipment toward positions that would give them clear lines of approach to the base. Most concerning of all, the timeline indicated that the attack was imminent, possibly within the next 48 to 72 hours. Sarah faced a terrible dilemma. Military protocol demanded that she present her findings through proper channels, which meant going directly to Commander Hayes despite their recent confrontation. But she also knew that Hayes was likely to dismiss her analysis, particularly given the timing of her discovery on the eve of her forced transfer. The commander might see it as a desperate attempt to avoid reassignment or as insubordination disguised as intelligence work. As dawn approached, Sarah made a decision that would define not only her military career but potentially save hundreds of lives. She would present her findings to Hayes one final time, regardless of the personal consequences. If he dismissed her warnings, she would have to find another way to ensure that the base was prepared for what was coming. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0800 hours, and Sarah knew it might be her last opportunity to make her case. She gathered her evidence carefully, organizing it in a way that would be impossible to dismiss or ignore. Charts, intercepts, analysis reports, and photographic evidence were arranged in a logical sequence that told a clear and terrifying story. As soldiers began their morning routines throughout the base, Sarah prepared for what could be the most important presentation of her career. The sun was rising over the desert horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed ominous given what she knew was coming. In a few hours, she would either convince her commanding officer to take action, or she would be forced to watch helplessly as disaster approached. The irony was not lost on her that the commander who had ordered her to leave might soon depend on her expertise for survival. Military service had taught her many lessons about duty, honor, and sacrifice, but none had prepared her for a situation where her professional dismissal and the base's survival were so intimately connected. Sarah took one last look at her analysis, double-checking every detail and connection. She knew that when she walked into that briefing room, she would be fighting not just for her own credibility, but for the lives of every person on the base. The enemy's plan was sophisticated and deadly, but it was not yet too late to stop it, if anyone would listen to what she had to say. The morning briefing began exactly as Sarah had expected, with Commander Hayes barely acknowledging her presence in the room. The command center buzzed with the usual pre-mission energy as senior staff members reviewed overnight intelligence reports and discussed patrol schedules. Sarah sat at the back of the room, her carefully prepared analysis folder clutched in her hands, waiting for the right moment to present her findings. Hayes ran through the standard operational updates with mechanical precision, his weathered face showing no emotion as he discussed troop rotations, supply deliveries, and routine security protocols. To him, this was just another day managing a forward operating base in a region that had seen too many years of low-level conflict and tension. He had no reason to suspect that his base had become the target of the most serious enemy operation in decades. When Hayes called for additional intelligence reports, Sarah stood up, her heart racing despite her years of military training. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and she could sense the mixture of curiosity and awkwardness from her colleagues who knew about her impending transfer. Commander Hayes, I need to present urgent intelligence findings that directly affect the security of this base, Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. Hayes looked at her with barely concealed irritation. "Captain Mitchell, I believe we discussed yesterday that you would be departing for reassignment this morning. Perhaps you should be focusing on your travel preparations instead of sir," Sarah interrupted, knowing that military protocol discouraged such interruptions but also knowing that lives hung in the balance. "I have evidence of an imminent nuclear strike against this position. The enemy has tactical nuclear capabilities positioned within striking distance, and all intelligence indicates an attack within the next 48 hours. The room fell completely silent. The magnitude of Sarah's claim was so shocking that even Hayes seemed momentarily stunned. Nuclear weapons had not been used in combat since World War II, and the prospect of tactical nuclear deployment in their region represented an escalation that no one had seriously considered possible. Hayes recovered quickly, his expression shifting from surprise to anger. "Captain Mitchell, that is an extremely serious accusation, and, frankly, given your recent performance issues, I find it highly suspect that you would present such dramatic claims on the morning of your departure." Sarah had anticipated this reaction, and she calmly approached the front of the room, spreading her analysis across the briefing table. "Commander, the evidence is comprehensive and verifiable. I have intercepted communications, satellite imagery correlation, and pattern analysis that all point to the same conclusion." As she began to walk through her findings, Sarah could see some of the other officers leaning forward with interest, recognizing the thoroughness of her work despite Hayes's obvious skepticism. Major Kevin Thompson, the base's operations officer, examined the satellite photographs with growing concern, while Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Walsh, the senior intelligence liaison, studied the communication intercepts with professional intensity. "These supply convoy movements are unusual," Major Thompson observed, pointing to a series of photographs that showed heavy equipment being transported toward positions that offered clear approach routes to their base. "We've been monitoring standard enemy logistics, but this represents a significant escalation in their positioning." Sarah felt a surge of hope as she realized that at least some of the senior staff were taking her analysis seriously. She continued her presentation, explaining how seemingly routine enemy radio chatter contained coded references to its special package and final delivery that aligned perfectly with the unusual troop movements and equipment positioning. "The timeline is critical," Sarah emphasized, spreading out a chart that showed the correlation between various intelligence indicators. "All evidence suggests that the attack window opens within the next 36 to 48 hours. The enemy has been coordinating this operation for weeks, positioning assets and waiting for optimal conditions." Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, who had remained silent during most of the briefing, finally spoke up. "Captain Mitchell, I've reviewed your previous intelligence assessments, and your track record for accuracy is exceptional. These intercepts show sophistication that would be consistent with a major operation." Hayes's face grew increasingly red as he watched his senior staff begin to take Sarah's warnings seriously. His authority was being challenged not just by a subordinate he had already decided to transfer, but by a female officer whose competence threatened his traditional view of military hierarchy. "I will not have this base thrown into panic based on speculation and pattern-seeking," Hayes declared, his voice rising. "Captain Mitchell has already demonstrated poor judgment and insubordination. This appears to be nothing more than an attention-seeking attempt to avoid her reassignment." The tension in the room became palpable as Sarah realized that Hayes was more concerned with maintaining his authority than with protecting the base. She had encountered this type of leadership before, officers who viewed admitting they might be wrong as a sign of weakness, even when lives were at stake. "Commander," Sarah said, maintaining her professional composure despite her growing frustration, "I understand your concerns about my motives, but I am requesting that you verify this intelligence through independent channels. Contact Regional Command, request satellite confirmation, or assign another intelligence officer to review my analysis. The evidence will speak for itself." Hayes was about to respond when Sergeant Rodriguez burst into the briefing room, his face flushed with urgency. "Commander Hayes, sir, we're picking up unusual electromagnetic activity in Sector 7. The communications team is detecting signature patterns that don't match any known friendly or standard enemy equipment. The electromagnetic readings provided an additional piece of evidence that supported Sarah's analysis. Nuclear weapons systems produced distinctive electronic signatures that were different from conventional military equipment, and the timing of these detections aligned perfectly with her intelligence timeline. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh immediately took charge of verifying the electromagnetic readings, ordering additional monitoring and requesting enhanced satellite surveillance of the suspected enemy positions. Major Thompson began reviewing defensive preparations and evacuation protocols, treating Sarah's warnings with the seriousness they deserved. Hayes found himself increasingly isolated as his senior staff began to act on Sarah's intelligence. His position became even more untenable when a priority communication arrived from Regional Command, reporting unusual enemy activity that correlated with the patterns Sarah had identified. "Commander," Lieutenant Colonel Walsh said after reviewing the new information, "I strongly recommend that we implement immediate defensive measures and request backup from regional assets. The convergence of evidence suggests that Captain Mitchell's analysis is accurate." The weight of command responsibility finally broke through Hayes's stubborn resistance. Faced with confirmation from multiple sources and pressure from his senior staff, he was forced to acknowledge that Sarah's warnings could not be dismissed. However, his pride prevented him from giving her full credit for potentially saving the base. "Very well," Hayes said grudgingly, "we will implement elevated security protocols and request additional surveillance assets. But I want independent confirmation of all intelligence assessments before we take any dramatic action." Sarah knew that this partial acknowledgement was the best she could hope for under the circumstances. The important thing was that the base would now be preparing for the threat she had identified, even if Hayes refused to admit that she had been right. As the briefing dissolved into urgent planning sessions, Sarah found herself both relieved and frustrated. Her warnings were being taken seriously, which meant that lives might be saved, but she also knew that Hayes's reluctance to fully embrace her analysis could still prove costly. Partial preparation might not be sufficient if the enemy attack proved to be as devastating as she suspected. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked closely with the intelligence team to monitor enemy communications and track the movement of suspicious assets. The evidence continued to mount, with each new piece of information reinforcing her original analysis. Enemy forces were clearly preparing for something significant, and all indicators pointed toward forward operating Base Sentinel as their primary target. The base transformed from its usual routine operations into a state of heightened readiness. Defensive positions were reinforced, additional ammunition was distributed, and communication protocols were established with regional command. However, Sarah could see that many of the preparations were focused on conventional attack scenarios rather than nuclear threats. As evening approached, Sarah realized that her time at the base was running out. Her transfer orders were still in effect, and Hayes had made it clear that her departure would proceed as scheduled, despite the ongoing crisis. The irony was bitter. She had identified the most serious threat the base had ever faced, but she would be forced to leave just as the danger reached its peak. The electronic surveillance equipment continued to detect unusual activity, and satellite imagery showed continued enemy movement toward attack positions. Sarah knew that her analysis had been correct, but she also knew that the base's preparation remained incomplete due to Hayes's continued resistance to acknowledging the full scope of the threat. That night, as she prepared for what might be her last hours at forward operating Base Sentinel, Sarah continued to monitor the intelligence feeds, hoping against hope that either the enemy would abandon their plan or that additional evidence would finally convince Hayes to take the nuclear threat seriously. The lives of everyone on the base hung in the balance, and time was rapidly running out. The night passed with agonizing slowness as Sarah monitored every communication channel and surveillance feed available to her. Despite Commander Hayes's orders for her departure, she had quietly remained in the intelligence center, using her security clearance to continue tracking the enemy movements that she knew posed an imminent threat to everyone on the base. The electromagnetic signatures were growing stronger, and intercepted communications were becoming more frequent and urgent in tone. At 0347 hours, Sarah detected something that made her blood run cold. A brief transmission in the enemy's tactical frequency contained a single word that she recognized from previous intelligence briefings: Prometheus. It was a code name that had appeared in classified reports about enemy nuclear capabilities, and its use in active communications could only mean one thing: the nuclear strike was about to begin. Sarah immediately attempted to contact Commander Hayes through the base's emergency communication system, but his aide informed her that the commander had given strict orders not to be disturbed unless there was an actual attack in progress. The cruel irony was that by the time an attack was visually confirmed, it would be too late to implement effective defensive measures, especially against a nuclear weapon. Faced with this impossible situation, Sarah made a decision that would either save hundreds of lives or end her military career permanently. She activated the base's general alarm system, sending personnel scrambling to battle stations and defensive positions throughout the facility. The piercing wail of sirens cut through the pre-dawn darkness, jolting everyone from sleep and routine duties into emergency response mode. Within minutes, Commander Hayes burst into the intelligence center, his face red with fury and his uniform hastily thrown on. "Captain Mitchell, you are in direct violation of orders. You have no authority to activate the general alarm, and you are supposed to be preparing for departure." "Commander," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, "I have confirmed enemy nuclear deployment. The code word Prometheus was transmitted 17 minutes ago, and all previous intelligence indicates that this is the final go-ahead for the strike." Hayes's anger faltered slightly as he processed the significance of what Sarah was telling him. The code name Prometheus was indeed associated with enemy nuclear capabilities in classified intelligence reports, and its use represented a level of threat escalation that even he could not ignore completely. Before Hayes could respond, Sergeant Rodriguez burst into the room with additional intelligence that validated Sarah's actions. "Commander, we're detecting massive electromagnetic interference in sectors 4 through 7, consistent with tactical nuclear system activation. Additionally, satellite imagery shows enemy forces moving to minimum safe distances from our position." The convergence of evidence was becoming impossible to deny, but Hayes remained reluctant to fully acknowledge the severity of the situation or Sarah's role in identifying it. His military training told him to take the threat seriously, but his personal animosity towards Sarah created a dangerous hesitation that could prove costly. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh arrived in the intelligence center moments later, having been awakened by the general alarm. She quickly reviewed the latest intelligence data and the timeline of Sarah's discoveries, her expression growing increasingly grave as she processed the information. "Commander Hayes," Walsh said with the authority of her rank and experience, "based on the totality of evidence, I am recommending immediate implementation of nuclear attack protocols. We need to begin evacuation of non-essential personnel and establish hardened communication links with regional command." The mention of nuclear attack protocols finally broke through Hayes's resistance. These were procedures that had been developed for the most extreme scenarios, and their activation represented an acknowledgement that the base faced an existential threat. Even Hayes could not ignore the recommendation of his senior intelligence officer when supported by multiple streams of confirming evidence. "Very well," Hayes said reluctantly, "initiate nuclear defense protocols and begin evacuation procedures for support personnel. But I want continuous verification of all intelligence assessments." Sarah felt a surge of relief as the base finally began to take appropriate defensive measures. Personnel were moved to hardened bunkers designed to withstand conventional attacks, though she knew that protection against nuclear weapons would be limited regardless of the preparations they could make in the time available. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity as the base transformed from routine operations to nuclear defense posture. Communication systems were hardened against electromagnetic pulse effects, critical equipment was moved to protected locations, and personnel were issued protective gear designed to provide minimal protection against radiation exposure. Sarah worked alongside the intelligence team to track the final stages of enemy preparation, watching with growing anxiety as the electromagnetic signatures indicated that nuclear systems were approaching full activation. The intercepted communications had stopped almost entirely, which typically indicated that enemy forces had entered their final operational phase. At 0623 hours, satellite surveillance detected the most ominous sign yet: enemy forces had completed their withdrawal to distances that would provide protection from tactical nuclear effects. This movement pattern was the final confirmation that Sarah's analysis had been correct from the beginning. The enemy was prepared to deploy nuclear weapons against forward operating base Sentinel, and the attack window was now open. Commander Hayes, despite his previous reluctance, was forced to acknowledge the accuracy of Sarah's intelligence when regional command contacted the base with urgent warnings based on their own surveillance assets. The larger military structure had independently confirmed what Sarah had been trying to tell them for days: they were about to become the target of the first tactical nuclear strike in modern warfare. Captain Mitchell, Hayes said, approaching Sarah in the intelligence center where she continued to monitor enemy communications, "I need you to provide continuous updates on enemy status. Your expertise with their communication patterns may be our best early warning system." Sarah nodded professionally, putting aside her personal feelings about Hayes's previous treatment in favor of the mission at hand. "Commander, based on current enemy positioning and communication patterns, I estimate we have between 30 and 90 minutes before launch initiation. The nuclear system appears to be mobile, which gives them flexibility in timing and positioning. The base's defensive preparations were as complete as they could be given the limited time and resources available. Personnel had been moved to the most protected areas possible, communication systems had been hardened, and regional command had been notified of the imminent threat. However, everyone understood that survival would depend largely on the size and accuracy of the incoming nuclear weapon. At 0701 hours, Sarah detected a change in the electromagnetic signature pattern that made her heart race. The enemy nuclear system had entered its final activation sequence, and launch was now imminent. She immediately reported this to Hayes and the senior staff, knowing that they now had perhaps minutes rather than hours before the attack began. "All personnel to maximum protection positions," Hayes announced over the base communication system. "Nuclear strike is imminent." This is not a drill. The words that no one had ever expected to hear in modern warfare echoed through the base as soldiers and support personnel moved to their assigned protection areas. Sarah remained in the intelligence center with the essential personnel who would need to coordinate communication with regional command during and after the attack. As the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, Sarah continued to monitor the enemy systems, providing updates on the nuclear weapons status to Hayes and the senior staff. The electromagnetic signature indicated that the weapon was fully activated and ready for deployment, but the exact timing of launch remained uncertain. At 0718 hours, Sarah detected the unmistakable signature of launch initiation. The electromagnetic pattern showed the distinctive characteristics of a tactical nuclear weapon being fired, and she knew that the base now had only minutes before impact. "Nuclear launch detected," Sarah announced, her training overcoming the terror of the moment. "Impact in approximately 4 to 6 minutes based on estimated range and trajectory." Commander Hayes immediately activated the final warning protocols, alerting all personnel that nuclear impact was imminent and that they should take whatever additional protective measures were possible in the time remaining. The base fell silent except for the hum of essential electronic systems and the racing hearts of everyone who understood that they were about to experience something that no military unit had faced in over 70 years. Sarah continued to track the incoming weapon's progress through available surveillance systems, providing updates on its trajectory and estimated impact time. Her analysis had been proven tragically correct, but her early warning had also given the base precious time to prepare for what was coming. As the final minutes counted down, Sarah realized that her forced transfer had been forgotten in the crisis. She was no longer an unwanted female officer being sent away for insubordination. She had become the intelligence specialist whose expertise might mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for everyone on the base. The final seconds before impact felt like an eternity. Sarah watched the tracking displays as the incoming nuclear weapon approached its target, her professional training warring with the very human fear of what was about to happen. In the protected command bunker, the senior staff had gathered around the communication equipment, maintaining contact with regional command while preparing for the electromagnetic pulse that would temporarily disrupt their systems. Commander Hayes, despite his previous antagonism toward Sarah, had positioned himself near her workstation, recognizing that her intelligence expertise would be critical for assessing the aftermath of the attack and coordinating any necessary response. The irony was not lost on either of them. The officer he had tried to transfer away had become his most valuable asset in the base's darkest hour. At 0722 hours, the nuclear weapon detonated approximately 2 kilometers from the main base perimeter. The tactical nuclear device, smaller than the strategic weapons that most people associated with nuclear warfare, still produced a devastating explosion that lit up the desert landscape like a miniature sun. The flash was visible even through the heavily shielded windows of the command bunker, followed seconds later by the thunderous roar of the blast wave. The base's protective measures proved their worth as personnel in hardened positions survived the initial effects of the nuclear explosion. The electromagnetic pulse knocked out several communication systems temporarily, but the hardened equipment that Sarah had helped prioritize remained functional. Most importantly, the evacuation of non-essential personnel to maximum protection positions meant that casualties were far lower than they would have been if the base had been caught unprepared. Sarah immediately began assessing the damage through available surveillance systems and communication networks. The nuclear weapon had been positioned to maximize damage to the base's operational capabilities while minimizing the radiation exposure to surrounding civilian areas, a tactical choice that revealed the sophistication of enemy planning. Radiation levels are elevated but within survivable ranges for personnel in protected positions, Sarah reported as she analyzed the incoming data. The enemy chose a low-yield tactical weapon designed to destroy infrastructure while avoiding massive contamination effects. The choice of weapon type provided important intelligence about enemy intentions and capabilities. They had demonstrated their possession of nuclear weapons and their willingness to use them, but they had also shown restraint designed to limit international escalation. It was a calculated strike intended to achieve maximum psychological impact while maintaining some degree of deniability about the scale of nuclear escalation. Commander Hayes, his earlier skepticism completely abandoned in the face of the nuclear reality, turned to Sarah with an expression of grudging respect. "Captain Mitchell, your intelligence analysis saved this base and everyone on it. Without your early warning, we would have been caught completely unprepared for a nuclear attack." Sarah felt a complex mixture of validation and sadness as she received this acknowledgement. Her expertise had been proven correct in the most dramatic way possible, but the cost had been a nuclear attack that changed the nature of modern warfare forever. She had identified the threat and provided early warning, but she could not prevent the fundamental escalation that the enemy's use of nuclear weapons represented. The hours following the nuclear strike were chaotic as the base worked to assess damage, treat injured personnel, and re-establish communication with higher command structures. Regional military leadership was scrambling to understand the implications of the first nuclear weapon use in combat since World War II, while international diplomatic channels were exploding with activity as governments tried to prevent further escalation. Sarah found herself at the center of the intelligence effort to understand the full scope of enemy nuclear capabilities and intentions. Her analysis of the intercepted communications and her understanding of enemy operational patterns made her expertise invaluable for assessing whether additional nuclear strikes might be planned. Based on post-attack communications intercepts, Sarah briefed the senior staff 12 hours after the nuclear strike. The enemy appears to view this as a demonstration rather than the beginning of sustained nuclear operations. Their communications suggest they are waiting to assess international reaction before deciding on additional escalation. The intelligence picture that emerged in the days following the attack confirmed Sarah's analysis that the enemy had planned this operation for months. The nuclear capability had been secretly developed and deployed specifically to target NATO positions, with Forward Operating Base Sentinel chosen as the demonstration target because of its symbolic importance and relatively isolated location. The international response was swift and dramatic. Within 48 hours of the nuclear attack, NATO had mobilized significant additional forces to the region while diplomatic efforts worked frantically to prevent the conflict from escalating into full-scale nuclear warfare. The enemy's demonstration had achieved its intended psychological impact, but it had also triggered responses that they may not have fully anticipated. Commander Hayes, faced with the undeniable evidence of Sarah's competence and the crucial role her intelligence work had played in saving the base, was forced to confront his own prejudices and leadership failures. In his official report to Regional Command, he gave Sarah full credit for identifying the nuclear threat and providing the early warning that had enabled defensive preparations. Captain Mitchell's intelligence analysis was exceptional in both accuracy and timeliness, Hayes wrote in his after-action report. Her identification of the nuclear threat and her persistence in bringing it to command attention despite personal and professional obstacles represents the highest standards of military service and dedication to duty. The commendation was significant not just for Sarah's career, but for the precedent it set regarding the treatment of female officers in combat intelligence roles. Her success in identifying and responding to such a critical threat provided concrete evidence of the value that women brought to military operations, helping to break down barriers that had limited opportunities for female service members. Sarah's expertise in nuclear threat assessment made her a sought-after asset for NATO intelligence services dealing with the new reality of tactical nuclear weapons in regional conflicts. Instead of facing transfer to a lesser position, she found herself promoted and assigned to a specialized unit focused on countering nuclear proliferation and identifying emerging nuclear threats. The nuclear attack on Forward Operating Base Sentinel became a turning point in modern military history, demonstrating both the horrifying reality of tactical nuclear warfare and the critical importance of intelligence analysis in preparing for unprecedented threats. Sarah's role in identifying and responding to the threat was studied in military academies and intelligence schools as an example of how individual expertise and persistence could make the difference between survival and catastrophe. The personal relationship between Sarah and Commander Hayes evolved dramatically in the aftermath of the nuclear crisis. Hayes, forced to acknowledge his own failures in leadership and judgment, became an advocate for removing barriers that prevented qualified personnel from contributing their expertise regardless of gender or other irrelevant factors. "I nearly cost this base and everyone on it their lives because of my personal biases," Hayes admitted in a private conversation with Sarah weeks after the attack. "Your professionalism and dedication in the face of my unfair treatment probably saved hundreds of lives. I will spend the rest of my career trying to ensure that other qualified officers don't face the same obstacles you overcame." The transformation was remarkable but not entirely unexpected. Crisis situations often revealed both the best and worst aspects of leadership, and Hayes had ultimately chosen to learn from his mistakes rather than defensively justify them. His public acknowledgement of Sarah's contributions and his advocacy for systemic changes helped accelerate the military's evolution toward true merit-based evaluation of personnel. Sarah's experience also highlighted the broader challenges facing military organizations as they worked to integrate personnel from diverse backgrounds while maintaining operational effectiveness. Her success demonstrated that diversity could enhance rather than diminish military capability, but only if leaders were willing to overcome their preconceptions and evaluate personnel based on actual performance rather than assumptions. Years later, as Sarah advanced to senior leadership positions within NATO intelligence structures, she often reflected on the nuclear crisis that had defined her career. The enemy's willingness to use tactical nuclear weapons had changed the nature of international conflict permanently, requiring new forms of intelligence gathering and threat assessment that she helped develop and implement. The Forward Operating Base Sentinel incident became a case study in multiple areas: nuclear crisis management, intelligence analysis, leadership under pressure, and organizational adaptation to changing threats. Sarah's role in identifying and responding to the nuclear threat was recognized with numerous awards and commendations, but, more importantly, it helped establish precedents for how military organizations could better utilize the talents of all qualified personnel. The nuclear attack had lasted only seconds, but its implications continued to shape military doctrine and international relations for decades. Sarah's intelligence work had provided the early warning that enabled survival and response, proving that individual expertise and dedication could have strategic importance even in the face of the most devastating weapons ever created. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell and the nuclear crisis at Forward Operating Base Sentinel ultimately became a testament to the importance of merit-based leadership, the value of diverse perspectives in intelligence analysis, and the critical role that individual courage and competence play in protecting military units from unprecedented threats. Her persistence in pursuing intelligence indicators that others dismissed had literally saved hundreds of lives and helped shape the military's response to the new reality of tactical nuclear warfare in the 21st century.